Which is better, naturalism or classical theism? Specifically, which has the better theoretical virtues? Well, that's the question that we're going to be investigating in this video. Right, if we compare the theories. Okay, I promise, no more Oppie impressions. Okay, that's not a promise. Anyway, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and let's dig in. All right, so as I said at the outset, we are examining naturalism and classical theism. And in particular, we are comparing their theoretical merits. We're comparing how well they do with respect to the theoretical virtues. More specifically still, we are looking at my article recently published, Open Access in Religious Studies, Naturalism, Classical Theism, and First Causes. Basically, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go through the article. I'll probably provide some additional commentary here and there, but I'm just going to go through this because I figured that a lot of the content will be able to serve you guys, right? The purpose of my channel is to serve you, to help you think critically about the fundamental nature of reality. Far more important than the particular conclusions that I arrive at in my videos is helping you guys to see various ways to think about problems and to see them from different perspectives, to utilize the tools of critical, rational, reflective thought and apply them to domains that really matter about the ultimate fundamental nature of reality. I'm not here to bear some flag for a tribe and defend the tribe against objections or things like that. I'm here to serve. Anyway, if you enjoy my content, please smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, hit that subscribe button. But without further ado, let's get into the article. All right, so like I said, this is published open access, so you guys can click the link in the description and read the PDF for yourself, look at my resources and citations and references and notes and so on in there. The abstract, Enric F. Gell, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. Now, I actually have had the privilege of talking to this person via social media, in particular via Facebook, and he is wonderful. He is so nice. He is so awesome. And anyway, I just want to have a major shout out to him, major respect to him. And again, I'm just discussing his ideas here. There's nothing against him as a person. And I hope in the future to continue and grow in my friendship with Enric Gell. So yeah, anyway, the abstract. So Enric Gell has recently argued that classical theism enjoys a significant advantage over Graham Oppie's naturalism. According to Gell, classical theism, unlike Oppie's naturalism, satisfactorily answers two questions. The first question is how many first causes there are. And the second question is why is it that number rather than some other number? So in this video, I'm going to be replying to Gell's argument for classical theism's advantage over Oppie's naturalism. And of course, I'm going to draw some wider implications of my investigation for the gap problem and Christian doctrine along the way. So let's get into the introduction. So of course, we're talking about classical theism here, and I mean that in a kind of technical sense. And we don't just mean traditional monotheism or something along those lines. We mean a particular unique model of God. And it's unique in that it affirms four core theses: divine simplicity, divine timelessness, divine immutability, and divine impassibility. According to the doctrine of divine simplicity, or DDS, God has no physical, metaphysical, or logical parts. And of course, traditionally, this is taken to entail that in God, there's no distinction between his essence, that is, what he is, and his existence, that is, that he is, his act of existence. Nor is there a distinction in God between subject and accidents, individual in essence, individual in properties, act and potency, and the agent in the agent's actions. Instead, God just is his essence. He is his existence. He lacks accidents in the sense of intrinsic contingent features. So there's no sense in which God in himself could have been otherwise. He couldn't have different intrinsic belief states across worlds. He couldn't be in any way different across worlds as he is in himself. He also lacks properties in the sense of exemplifiables that are distinct from himself. So if God is omniscient, well, then he's going to be identical, numerically identical to his omniscience. Same with his omnipotence and aseity and timelessness and so on. He's also purely actual under this traditional classical theism that I'm talking about here, which means he lacks potential for change, as well as potential for cross-world variance. And God is identical to each of his acts. So everything God does on his end, his acts, he is numerically identical to each of those. Such are the commitments of the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity. Now, what is a part in this context? Well, at least in the context of divine simplicity, a part of God would be any positive ontological item intrinsic to, but distinct from God. Now, a positive ontological item is anything that exists or has being or reality. And as for intrinsicality, well, that's kind of debatable. Nothing here really hangs on a precise and formalized account of it. but we can kind of make do with the following reasonably intuitive articulation. So intrinsic properties are had by things in virtue of the way they themselves are, without referencing something wholly apart from or external to or outside of them. So we're not talking about the kind of ad extra relations that these things stand in. Rather, they are predicates and properties that characterize things as they are in themselves. By contrast, extrinsic properties are had in virtue of relations or lack of relations to other things. So according to divine simplicity, anything intrinsic to God is identical to God. And there's nothing intrinsic to God that is distinct from God. Now, much more, of course, can be said here, but that suffices for present purposes as a characterization of classical theism. We really only need to focus on divine simplicity and God's pure actuality as commitments of classical theism. But now, of course, let's consider a view on the opposite side of the metaphysical spectrum, Oppi's naturalism. So naturalism as such is variously characterized, but I'm going to be focusing here on Oppi's naturalism, which has been quite influential in philosophy of religion in particular. Now, in its most recent and well-developed articulation in his book with Kenny Pierce, it's his debate book. I highly recommend you guys check that out. Oppi's naturalism makes several core claims, and I've picked out 5 important and characteristic such claims here. First, natural reality exhausts causal reality. According to this thesis, every causal entity and causal property, so these are entities and properties that stand in causal relations, every causal entity and causal property is natural, where natural here signifies things recognized in ideal, completed, true science. Second thesis is mindedness is late and local. So minded beings, that is beings with minds or consciousness, these are either relatively recently evolved organisms or products of such organisms. Third, nothing is divine. So nothing causal is divine or sacred or worship-worthy. Fourth, shared history. So this is Oppi's metaphysics of modality. It's a kind of branching theory, a branching actualism theory, or we could say a causal powers-based theory, or an Aristotelian theory. Thinkers like Proust and Kuhns and Malpass and various others have at least expressed sympathies with this broad family of views. It's not to say that they endorse absolutely every single aspect of Oppi's view, but they endorse theories which are quite similar. Okay, so according to shared history, necessarily any possible way causal reality could be shares an initial history, that is, an initial world segment, with actual causal reality. In other words, for any possible causal reality, its history at some point coincides with the actual world's history. Oppi thus affirms that every possible world shares some initial history with the actual world, which we can call natural causal reality's initial state or initial singularity. The fifth thesis is chance divergence. So necessarily, the only way that possible causal histories diverge or branch from actual causal history is through objectively chancy events. So you can think of alternative possibilities as a kind of branching off, as maybe forking paths from an original path. The original path is the actual world, and different alternative possibilities are possible only in virtue of there being something actual with the indeterministic, chancy causal power of bringing about either of those alternatives. So having characterized the two worldviews being compared, let's get clear on my target. So in a recent article, Enric Gell argues that precisely because of its picture of God as a purely actual first cause of things, classical theism enjoys a significant advantage over Oppi's naturalism as a theory of the first cause. Gell offers 2 argumentative paths in favor of this claim, one where causal finitism is granted and another where a foundational layer of reality is granted. Gell's arguments advance debates about classical theism and so on, but ultimately I don't find them convincing. And so my task here is to explain why that is the case. So here's the general structure. I'm just going to begin by examining Gell's first argumentative path from causal finitism. Then I'm going to examine his second argumentative path from a foundational layer of reality. Next, I'm going to examine 2 arguments that non-classical theisms enjoy the same advantage that, according to Gell, accrues to classical theism over Oppi's naturalism. And finally, along the way, I'm going to be drawing out wider implications of my investigation, both for the gap problem and the Christian doctrine of Trinitarianism. So let's move on to Gell's first argumentative path. So again, this argumentative path derives from causal finitism. So causal finitism says that infinite causal histories are metaphysically impossible. If you're curious, I actually have a whole playlist on the Kalam cosmological argument. I highly recommend checking that out. And in there, I look at causal finitism in tremendous depth. I have lots of different videos dedicated to causal finitism, looking at the arguments for it, critically examining those, and so on. So definitely check out that playlist for those of you who are interested in causal finitism. If we rule out, moreover, circles of causation, well then causal finitism, together with the relatively innocuous claim that something is a cause, straightforwardly entails that there is at least one uncaused first cause. Now, at this juncture, Gell raises the following questions. First, how many such first causes are there? And second, why are there exactly that many? Well, according to Gell, there are two possible answers to the second question. Either A, it's a brute fact with no explanation, or B, it's a necessary fact that could not have been otherwise. Now, one thing we should note at this juncture is that it's actually not clear that this is right. So Gell is importing both explanatory and modal notions into the answers to the second question. And given this, there are actually four permutations of possible answers. It could be a contingent, unexplained fact. It could be a contingent, non-causally explained fact. It could be a necessary, unexplained fact, or it could be a necessary, non-causally explained fact. Now, a few notes at this juncture. So first, a contingent fact is one that obtains but could have failed to obtain. By contrast, a necessary fact is one that obtains and could not have failed to obtain. It must obtain. It obtains in every possible world. And note that I've put here non-causal explanations in number 2 and number 4 because, as Gell rightly points out, we are here concerned with the first causes, right? And hence these things are uncaused causes. So any explanation of why there is that number is going to have to be a non-causal explanation, because these things are uncaused. Now, ideally, we want our theory to answer 2 or 4, as these alone offer a gain in theoretical explanatoriness. Moreover, we want the resultant gain in explanatoriness not to be outweighed by a cost in theoretical complexity. Regarding the first question, that is, how many first causes are there, Gell writes that due to Occam's razor, out of 2 equally explanatorily efficacious accounts, we should prefer that which posits fewer entities and is hence simpler. But Occam's razor doesn't merely advise us to posit fewer entities, right? It also advises us to posit fewer kinds of entities, right? Occam's razor enjoins us to not multiply entities or kinds of entities without necessity. The former relates to a theory's quantitative simplicity. So if you're just talking about how many entities there are, that's simply a quantitative simplicity measure. Whereas the latter, that is how many kinds of entities there are, that is a qualitative or categorical simplicity. So we can make a distinction between quantitative and qualitative or categorical simplicity. Moreover, given that Gell is critiquing Oppie, we should also take into account the 3 elements of simplicity that Oppie employs to assess theories. First is ontological simplicity. All else being equal, a worldview committed to fewer things and fewer kinds of things is superior to one committed to more things and more kinds of things. The second is ideological simplicity. All else being equal, a worldview employing fewer undefined primitive expressions is superior to one employing more undefined primitive expressions. And thirdly, theoretical simplicity. All else being equal, a worldview committed to fewer and less complicated fundamental principles is superior to one committed to more and more complicated fundamental principles. Fundamental principles, by the way, are just theoretical posits, so certain claims that you have to make, you have to build into your theory without being able to derive them from other posits. So, with all these methodological points covered, we can now turn to Gell's main argument, which he's trying to show, again, that classical theism is superior to naturalism as a theory of the first cause with respect to simplicity at this point. So let's turn precisely to that, to simplicity. So here is Gell's overall argument. The advantage I want to ascribe, and I'm quoting Gell here, the advantage I want to ascribe to the pure act theists, so I've been calling it classical theism, but Gell calls it pure act theism. He also calls it classical theism, I believe, if I recall correctly, but both of them are expressing the same idea. So the advantage I want to ascribe to the pure act theists candidate for a first cause is that by adopting it, we're able to, 1, get an answer to the question of how many first causes there are, 2, explain why there is that number rather than another, namely, as we'll see below, because there can be no other, and 3, such a number could not possibly be lower, end quote. The classical theists' answer to question number 1 there is obviously 1. According to Gell, this also establishes 3, since 1 is the simplest possible answer to how many first causes there are. But this is actually not so clear given the above-mentioned methodological points that we just covered in the previous subsection. For simplicity isn't merely a matter of the fewest number of entities posited. That is the quantitative simplicity element of Occam's razor and Oppie's ontological simplicity. It's also a matter, crucially, of 1, the fewest kinds of entities posited, that is the qualitative simplicity component of Occam's razor and Oppie's ontological simplicity, 2, fewer undefined primitive expressions, that is Oppie's ideological simplicity, and 3, fewer and less complicated fundamental principles, that is Oppie's theoretical simplicity. And here's the rub, right? It's actually not at all clear that classical theism wins out on simplicity, considering 1 through 3, in addition, of course, to what Gell does consider, namely only the quantitative simplicity element of Occam's razor. If anything, I say, Oppie's naturalism seems to win out here. And so let's proceed then through each aspect of simplicity. For each aspect, I'll examine both A, the simplicity of the respective theories as postulates about the first cause, namely the number thereof, the nature thereof, and so on, as well as B, the overall simplicity of the respective theories. I examine A because Gell himself seems to focus primarily thereon. Gell, after all, is here comparing the simplicity of the theories' answers to the question in 1, which is only about what the theories say concerning the first cause. But it's crucial to consider B as well, for even if one theory has a theoretically simpler view of the first cause, it may only secure this at the cost of a more complex overall theory. Indeed, I find that B is what really matters here. For if T as a theory is simpler than T star in B's sense, but more complex in A's sense, we should clearly prefer T over T star, right? When we compare theories, we don't compare their simplicity with respect to some small domain. We compare their simplicity full stop, and we settle on the overall simpler theory, assuming, of course, explanatory parity. Thus, I think far more weight should be placed on B. But of course, because Gell seems to focus on A, I will also examine that as well. So anyway, let's now examine the quantitative simplicity element of Occam's razor. So we're just going to be going through here the various different elements of simplicity, and we're going to be comparing naturalism and theism with respect to those elements, and specifically with respect to A and B. Remember, A is the simplicity of the respective theories as postulates about the first cause, and B is the overall simplicity of the theories as such. First, in terms of how many first causes are posited, which is A, the answer for both classical theism and Oppie's naturalism is 1. For Oppie, the first cause is the initial singularity, and there is only one such thing. As Oppie writes in his debate with Kenny Pierce, quote, Kenny says there is one initial thing, God. I say there is one initial thing, which I will call the initial singularity, end quote. Now, I've got a little footnote there. Whether Oppie thinks multiple things make up the initial singularity, Oppie doesn't say, but it's important to note that Oppie himself thinks that there is only one initial thing, as the quote reveals. I recognize, though, that this point may not go very far, precisely because Oppie doesn't say whether multiple things compose the initial singularity. And as an anonymous referee helpfully pointed out, in a sense, all parties to the debate accept only one first cause. Even if one thinks that there are, say, 10 causally initial entities, one might still speak of the single state that they make up. The point of Gell's article, however, as this referee pointed out, was to examine precisely the question of how many entities, quote unquote, make up the causally initial state. And so if Oppie does not, or else cannot say how many entities make up the initial singularity, he clearly doesn't have an explanation of how many entities make up the initial singularity. So perhaps Gell does, after all, pinpoint an advantage of classical theism over naturalism when it comes to the A component of quantitative simplicity. Though I think the jury is still out on this, because Oppie has henceforth not explicitly said how many entities make up the first cause, and we cannot infer from his silence there that he has no position on the matter. And finally, I stress that this concession only applies to the A component of quantitative simplicity. I've argued, though, that we should really be concerned solely with the B component of the various elements of simplicity. All right, back to the text. So again, the first point is just like in terms of how many first causes are posited, which is A, both theories actually posit one first cause. And then the second point is that in terms of the overall quantitative simplicity, which is B, that B element that we've been talking about, Oppie's naturalism seems clearly superior to classical theism. For Oppie's entities are a proper subset of the classical theists. The classical theist, no less than Oppie, thinks that the natural world exists. For Oppie, that's all. But for the classical theist, that's not all. There's also a purely actual God. Oppie's naturalism, therefore, seems to enjoy an edge in terms of the quantitative simplicity element of Occam's razor. All right, so let's now move on to the qualitative simplicity element of Occam's razor. First, in terms of how many kinds of first cause are posited, which is A, it isn't clear how to assess classical theism and Oppie's naturalism. As explained above, both theories posit only one causally and or temporally initial thing. We might conclude from this that they therefore each posit only one kind of initial thing. But what makes this difficult is that one thing can be a member of multiple kinds. Right? Api's initial singularity is a member of many kinds: natural things, necessary things, physical things, impersonal things, and so on. The classical theistic God, too, is a member of many kinds: supernatural things, necessary things, non-physical things, personal things, and so on. Thus, in terms of the theories' answer to how many kinds of first cause there are, there's really no clear winner here. But there is, I think, a clear winner when it comes to overall qualitative simplicity, which is the B element. For classical theism introduces whole hosts of kinds into one's ontology, in addition to those Api's naturalism admits. For Api, everything uniformly falls into the kinds natural, physical, limited, and so on. But classical theism not only recognizes such kinds, but also postulates additional kinds: supernatural, non-physical, unlimited, and so on. Once again, because both Api and the classical theist are committed to the natural world and all the things entailed therefrom, while the classical theist believes in God in addition, the kinds postulated by Api's naturalism are a proper subset of those of classical theism. Once more, then, Api's theory seems to enjoy an edge in terms of the quantitative simplicity element of Occam's razor. What then about ideological simplicity? So first, in terms of how many primitive undefined expressions are used to describe the first cause, which is the A element, there is once more no clear winner. To determine a winner, we would need a fleshed out characterization of the initial state from Api and God from the classical theist. We would then need to define as many of the terms as we can, and, upon reaching analytical bedrock, count the number of primitive undefined expressions contained in the respective characterizations. Obviously enough, this is a task that lies far beyond the scope of this video and the article, and it's not clear which theory would edge out. What then should we say about overall ideological simplicity, which is, again, the B component, the one that really matters? Well, here again, Api's naturalism seems to win out. For the classical theist, like the naturalist, is committed to the natural world, and with it, all the primitive undefined vocabulary needed to describe it. But the classical theist needs additional primitive undefined vocabulary to describe God. This is especially true for Thomistic classical theism, something to which Gell frequently appeals. For such a view makes considerable use of analogical expressions to characterize God. But as Api points out in Pierce and Api 2022 on multiple occasions, such expressions are new primitive undefined expressions. In short, the primitive undefined expressions used in Api's naturalism are a proper subset of those used in classical theism. Api's naturalism once more edges out. Now let's turn to theoretical simplicity. For the same reason as in the previous paragraph, there doesn't seem to be a clear winner when we restrict our focus to the theory's principles concerning the first cause, which is the A component. But once more, Api's naturalism seems to edge out classical theism when it comes to overall theoretical simplicity, which is the B component. For Api, we should treat all claims, that is, principles, as fundamental except those that have been explicitly shown to be logical consequences of other things to which we are committed. Now consider what an ideal worldview would say about the natural universe. It would provide a complete specification of the initial state of the universe, the laws of nature governing its evolution over time, and the outcomes of every chance event. By Api's lights, logical consequence affords no possibilities to compress this information, and so on Api's account, we should suppose that it is all fundamental. But nothing about God's nature logically entails facts about the initial state of the universe, the laws of nature, or the outcomes of chance events. Classical theism, then, no less than naturalism, must take such specifications as fundamental. But such specifications are all Api's naturalism needs, since Api's naturalism commits only to the natural universe. The classical theist, however, commits both to the natural universe and to God, and hence the classical theist will accrue theoretical complexity costs deriving from additional specifications about God. I don't, of course, claim that the above considerations are decisive or insuperable or whatever. By my lights, however, they at least cast doubt on Gell's appeal to simplicity. Having covered simplicity, let's now consider explanatory power. In particular, we are looking at the explanatory power of naturalism and classical theism with respect to explaining the number of first causes. So according to Gell, classical theism enjoys an explanatory advantage over Api's naturalism when it comes to explaining exactly how many first causes there are. For the classical theist, there is exactly one purely actual first cause because there can only be one purely actual thing. That is, because a purely actual thing is not susceptible of multiplication. My criticism is that the arguments Jill offers for the impossibility of multiple purely actual beings do not succeed, and hence that Jill has not succeeded in showing classical theism's explanatory advantage over Oppe's naturalism. Jill's first argument for the necessary uniqueness of a purely actual thing runs as follows. A purely actual thing's essence would just be pure esse itself. Esse is existence, or an act of existence. So what he's saying here is that a purely actual thing's essence would just be pure existence itself. But then such a thing could not be multipliable because it could not be subjected to any differentiating feature, as a genus is multiplied in its species by the addition of a specific difference, or a species in its individuals by the addition of matter. There is nothing outside pure being that could act with respect to it as a differentiating feature, as the specific difference rationality is outside the genus animal, or as matter is outside form, because outside pure being, there is only non-being, and non-being is nothing. So pure being could not be differentiated as pure being into multiple instances of itself, such as pure being A, pure being B, pure being C, and so on. Hence, a purely actual reality that was pure being itself, and such is the classical theist's picture of God, would have to be unique out of metaphysical necessity. End quote. So let's formalize this, right? So let's get formal, let's get funky. The argument, in short, runs as follows. Premise 1. For there to be more than one thing that is pure esse, that is to say. Okay, anyway, back. Okay, so his argument is as follows. Premise 1. For there to be more than one thing that is pure esse, or pure being itself, there would have to be some feature or features that differentiates each from the others. 2, but nothing that is pure esse could have such a differentiating feature. So there cannot be more than one thing that is pure esse. That's 3. But 4, whatever is purely actual is pure esse. And so if there cannot be more than one thing that is pure esse, and whatever is purely actual is indeed pure esse, well, then there can't be more than one purely actual thing, right? If there can't be more than one thing with brown hair, and every bear has brown hair, well, then there can't be two bears, right? Because if there were two bears, then there would be two things with brown hair. But we've already said that there can't be more than one thing with brown hair, and so there must be only one bear. That's a little bit of a strange example. But again, if there can't be more than one thing that's pure esse, and whatever is purely actual is pure esse, well, then there clearly cannot be more than one purely actual thing. If there could be more than one purely actual thing, and whatever is purely actual is pure esse, well, then there could be more than one thing that is pure esse. But of course, there cannot be more than one thing that is pure esse per 3. Okay, so I hope you see why that follows. We should note first that Gell offers no justification for premise 1 here. He simply asserts that multipliability requires the possession of some differentiating feature. Gell's claim that, quote, such a thing could not be multipliable because it could not be subjected to any differentiating feature, that's only true if multipliability requires some differentiating feature. So again, that's the first note. It's just a flat assertion. We haven't been given any reason to accept premise 1. We should also note, second, that premise 1 amounts to the deeply controversial identity of indiscernibles, or IOI. Now, at this juncture, I am so proud of this, people. Look at this footnote. Look at this footnote, number 12, okay? IOI is not to be confused with LOL, which I'm told is an acronym the youths use for laughing out loud. Okay, I got this published. Sorry, I can't believe that. I'm very proud of that. Anyway, I'm just going to just let this sit on the screen here for a second because I'm very proud. Okay, anyway, that's one of the proudest moments of my life. You have to let me have this, okay? But anyway, my first response is that there's no justification for premise 1. And then the second response is that premise 1 amounts to the deeply controversial identity of indiscernibles, or IOI. So here's a little fancy formulation of identity of indiscernibles, or IOI, for all x and for all y. If it is the case that every f that x has is such that y has that f too, and vice versa, then x is identical to y. Okay, let me state that over again. For any x and any y, if it is the case that for any property f, x is f if and only if y is f, well then x is numerically identical to y. Okay, that's a little bit complicated. So let me break it down now. Okay, so IOI states that for any objects x and y, if for every feature f, it is true that x is f if and only if y is f, then x is identical to y. In other words, if x and y share all and only the exact same features in common, well, then x is identical to y. So contraposing this, we get if x is distinct from y, well, then there is some feature that one has that the other lacks. And this, in turn, is simply to say that multipliability requires some differentiating feature. Given the controversial nature of IOI, I should note this is a monumentally controversial principle in metaphysics. So given its controversial nature, it seems dialectically ill-suited simply to assume it here. I mean, the principal motivation behind it seems to be explicability. If x and y share all and only the same features, in virtue of what could they be distinct or individuated from one another? Given the nature of the case, right, we can't pinpoint something had by one and not the other. And in that case, their individuation, their distinctness, the fact that they're distinct things would seem to be primitive or brute. But it's not clear whether we should be sanguine about this motivation. Why can't individuation or distinctness simply be primitive? In that case, there need not be some feature that grounds things as distinction. At the very least, we need some positive argument in favor of the principle, since the onus of justification in this context is on Gell to demonstrate necessary uniqueness, right? He's the one trying to give an positive argument here. Indeed, there seems to be a prima facie plausible argument that individuation or distinctness must ultimately be primitive. For we can equally ask, in virtue of what are those individuating features of x and y individuated? If they're not individuated by anything, then we have primitive individuation, which is precisely what IOI sought to avoid. If they have some further differentiating features, then we're off on a vicious regress, right? Because we can further ask of those features in virtue of what are they individuated, and so on ad infinitum. And so on ad infinitum. It's a sort of capitalist regress, right? It's a regress of ideology. Now, you might object here. It's not as though we're positing two features, f and f star, where x is f and y is f star, that individuate x from y. Rather, we're simply saying that one has a feature that the other lacks. That is, we are simply saying that x is f, whereas y is not f. And further, you might continue, there's nothing primitive or brute about the individuation of or distinction between being f on the one hand and not being f on the other. So that's an objection you might raise to me at this juncture. But I think this objection only helps my case. For suppose x is distinct from y. Well, then x is not y, and y is not x. But if there is nothing primitive or brute about the individuation of or distinction between being f and not being f, well, then there's equally nothing primitive or brute about the individuation of or distinction between being x and not being x. And if there's nothing primitive or brute about this, then this is surely all we need to say in accounting for the distinction between x and y. No appeal need be made to individuating features. In short, to avoid a vicious regress of ever more individuating features, the proponent of IOI must say that the individuation of or distinction between being f and not being f is either self-explained or primitive. But then this is precisely what the opponent of IOI can say about the first order individuation of or distinction between being X and not being X. So again, I think this objection only helps my case. But back to the main text, what I say here is that it seems that we must ultimately then bottom out in primitive individuation. It seems to be unavoidable. So that is what I say in response to premise one. Firstly, there's no justification for it presented. Secondly, it rests on IOI, but the principal motivation of IOI is implausible, given that it's motivated, it seems, by trying to avoid a primitive individuation. But as I've just argued, that's unavoidable. So what then about premise two? Well, recall, premise two says that nothing that is pure essay could have such a differentiating feature, that is to say. So it says nothing that is pure essay could have such a differentiating feature. Well, let's first consider Gell's proffered justification thereof. Quote, there is nothing outside pure being that could act with respect to it as a differentiating feature, because outside pure being, there is only non-being, and non-being is nothing. So, I'm not sure what to make of this, mainly because I don't understand what outside means here. It certainly can't mean distinct from, since there most definitely are things distinct from pure being. But if it doesn't mean distinction, I don't know what it means. I truly struggle to see what it could mean. Of course, that isn't an objection to Gell's proffered justification, but I mean, I'm simply noting what I take to be an unclarity in such justification that entirely hinders proper analysis and evaluation thereof. And the unclarity would also hinder proper justification for premise two. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Time lasts, space lasts, immaterial, enormously powerful, measure, pleasure. It follows logically and inescapably from the premises. Okay, I need to stop. So anyway, that's my first response to what Gell says on behalf of premise two. There's just an unclarity that prevents Gell from properly justifying it, but also somewhat prevents me from analyzing it. Analyzing Gell's proffered justification for it, that is. I can still analyze premise two, which is my second response here. So let's move on to that. Second, there seem to be several plausible candidates, at least in principle, for features that differentiate among beings of pure esse. Consider first that most Thomistic classical theists think that being pure esse is compatible with being Trinitarian, that is, existing as three persons. One thing we should note here is that we're setting aside whether or not this is actually a true claim of theirs. You can see the discussion on my channel between Ryan Mullins and Rob Coons for an interaction on this question. It was such a good conversation. I think it has like 6,000 views at this point. It was one of my earlier videos. It's something like, is divine simplicity compatible with Trinitarianism? I also have a blog post on this where I just test out a bunch of different arguments. It's more so an experimental blog post, but I think it's called something like Some Short Quasi Tensions Between DDS and Trinitarianism or something like that. So you can check that out in case you are interested. It's a kind of experimental blog post. So anyway, check if that's on My Majesty of Reason WordPress blog. We're not going to consider whether or not these are actually compatible. My point is that lots of Thomistic theists think that being pure esse is compatible, is not strictly inconsistent with being Trinitarian. But if that's so, well, then surely being pure esse is also compatible, that is, logically consistent with being, say, Unitarian, that is, existing as one person, right? It's not as though Jews and Muslims are prevented from affirming the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity, and with it, God's being identical to his existence by dint of their Unitarianism. It would also seem intolerably ad hoc and inexplicable if Trinitarianism, but not Unitarianism or Binitarianism or whatever, was compatible with God's being pure esse. If all of this is correct, then we have on our hands a clear candidate in principle, just logically speaking, for a differentiating feature among purely actual beings of pure esse, namely the number of persons in which they exist. In principle, one being of pure esse could be Unitarian, another could be Binitarian, still another could be Trinitarian, and so on, right? I don't claim here that these are genuine metaphysical possibilities, right? The onus really here, and I could have added a sentence here, but the onus here is on Gell because he's the one who's offering a positive argument aiming to demonstrate the necessary uniqueness of a purely actual thing of pure esse. He would have to show why these other things are metaphysical impossibilities, right? Because if he doesn't show that, well, then we have an undercutting defeater for his argument that removes his justification. So it's not my job to positively show that these are genuine metaphysical possibilities. It's his job to show that they're metaphysically impossible. But again, to raise my critique, I'm not claiming here that these are genuine metaphysical possibilities. My point is simply that the argument that there cannot, even in principle, be something that differentiates beings of pure esse, it's not a conceptual or logical matter. You can't just derive it from what it is to be pure esse, that it is necessarily unique, because you have all these other alternative ways in principle that are perfectly consistent for something that is purely actual, a being that is purely actual and pure esse to be differentiated from one another. So again, we're examining Gell's premise two. I first noted something that hinders proper justification for Gell's premise, namely an unclarity in one of his terms. The second thing that I noted was that there are actually plausible candidates, contrary to premise two, that could serve as features differentiating among beings of pure esse. The first thing that I said in this regard was that, hey, the number of persons in which the thing exists, in principle, could be one such differentiating feature. That's the first subpoint that I'm making within my second response. Here's the second subpoint that I'm making within my second response. So consider second the distinction between being identical to one's own active existence and being identical to existence simpliciter, or existence as such. Thomistic metaphysics already admits that there are, roughly speaking, different acts of existence. Set aside whether or not that's intelligible. You can check out my video on ontological monism and ontological pluralism with Dr. Trenton Merrickx. I think it's called something like Existence and Ontological Pluralism. So check out that video. We criticize the ontological pluralist view that Thomists hold. We go through one of Trenton Merrickx's papers published in the journal Nous called The Only Way to Be. But anyway, set aside whether or not this is intelligible, right? Still, Thomistic metaphysics already admits that there are, roughly speaking, different acts of existence. My act of existence, for instance, is not the same as God's act of existence with which God is identical. If they were the same, well, then I would be a composite of essence and, well, God, right? God would be an internal principle that composes me as an essence existence composite. But that is, of course, clearly contrary to classical theism. And as Gavin Kerr notes, the esse commune that creatures receive is quote unquote somewhat lesser and quote unquote somewhat other than the esse tantum of God. Okay, moving on. God then is identical not to the existence of you or me or trees or poo. He's identical to his own act of existence. But in that case, it's not clear why there cannot be two things which are identical to their acts of existence, right? They could presumably each be identical to their own respective acts of existence, which are different from one another. These acts of existence, moreover, could presumably be primitively distinct, which, as I argued in my discussion of IOI, seems not only possible but unavoidable. Primitive distinction or individuation, that is. And note that the proposal here is not that each being shares an essence with the other and also has, in addition, its own respective act of existence. The proposal instead is that each individual and each individual's essence is identical to its own respective act of existence. And so, a fortiori, their essences are numerically distinct from one another. So anyway, that's my second response. You could have two things. It seems in principle that you could have two things, each of which is identical to their own acts of existence, such that their acts of existence are just primitively distinct. That's another reason to reject premise 2 of Gell's argument. Finally, and here's a third reason to reject premise 2 of Gell's argument, at least for those who accept Trinitarianism. So I would actually argue that Gell's argument here is incompatible with Trinitarianism for the exact same reasons for thinking that there could only be one purely actual being of pure esse would equally motivate thinking that there could only be one purely actual divine person of pure esse, right? IOI, after all, is perfectly general, applying to any x and any y. Moreover, the principal motivation for IOI is equally general, right? If any x and y shared all and only the same features, well, then the fact that x is not numerically identical to y would be inexplicable or groundless, or so the proponents typically say on behalf of IOI. And so again, the reasons for thinking that there could only be one purely actual being of pure esse would, I claim, equally motivate thinking that there could only be one purely actual divine person of pure esse. And so we could just mount the following parity argument. This is pretty much structurally identical to Gell's argument offered earlier, but here's the parity. One, for there to be more than one divine person that is pure esse, there would have to be some feature that differentiates each from the others. This is a parody of his. For there to be more than one thing that is pure esse, there would have to be some feature that differentiates each from the others. The exact same reasons favoring this one are also going to be favoring this premise one. So for there to be more than one divine person that is pure esse, there would have to be some feature that differentiates each from the others. Otherwise, their distinction would be primitive or brute or inexplicable. But nothing that is pure esse could have such a differentiating feature. That's a premise in Gell's argument. And so it follows that there cannot be more than one divine person that is pure esse. But of course, under classical theism, right, to be God, to be divine is to be pure esse, right? Anything that isn't pure esse just isn't divine, right? And so anything divine is going to be pure esse. And of course, any divine person is divine, trivially. So any divine person is pure esse. That follows from number 4 and number 5. And if there cannot be more than one divine person that is pure esse, and any divine person is pure esse, well, then there cannot be more than one divine person. That just follows from 3 and 6. And yet, to say that there cannot be more than one divine person is to reject Trinitarianism. So in summary, Gell's argument, if successful, would equally vindicate the following argument. For there to be more than one divine person, there would have to be some feature that differentiates each from the others. But anything that is pure esse could not be subject to such a differentiating feature. Hence, at least one such divine person would not be pure esse. But anything divine, pure classical theism, is pure esse. Hence, at least one such divine person would not be divine after all. And that's absurd, right? It can't be the case that a divine person isn't divine. Hence, there cannot be more than one divine person. Let's now consider Gell's second argument, or at least variant of the first argument for uniqueness. So that's closing off my examination of his first argument that we've been examining here. But anyway, here is Gell's second argument for uniqueness. If a purely actual thing has to be absolutely simple or non-composite, and plausibly it has to, given that any composite is in potency with respect to its parts, or is a mixture of act and potency, then for there to be two absolutely simple beings, A and B, A would have to exhibit feature X that B lacked in order for them to be differentiated. But then A would not be an absolutely simple being, because it would have parts, contrary to the hypothesis. A would be what B is plus feature X. So, once more, there could not be any feature that distinguished two hypothetical absolutely simple things, without making it the case that one of them or both were not, after all, absolutely simple. End quote. Now, it's not at all clear why any composite is in potency with respect to its parts, and Gell simply asserts as much without justification. But set that aside. I think it's clear now that this second argument suffers from essentially the same problems as the first. It presupposes, without justification, IOI. IOI is deeply controversial, and moreover, primitive individuation seems ultimately unavoidable. Moreover, there are modes of differentiation entirely compatible with DDS, and the argument seems incompatible with Trinitarianism. So to draw out this last point, that the argument seems incompatible with Trinitarianism, consider a parity argument. So what I'm doing, I basically just copied and pasted what he said here and pasted it here with just the like mutatis mutandis, right? With like the appropriate modifications. Mutatis mutandis, it's a pizzeria. So on classical theism, whatever is divine is purely actual, and divine persons are divine, of course. Hence, on classical theism, divine persons are purely actual. But whatever is purely actual is absolutely simple or non-composite, right? This is what Gell starts saying up here. Whatever is purely actual has to be absolutely simple or non-composite. Hence, on classical theism, divine persons are absolutely simple or non-composite. Now, for there to be two absolutely simple divine persons, A and B, A would have to exhibit feature X that B lacked in order for them to be differentiated. But then A would not be an absolutely simple divine person, because it would have parts, contrary to the hypothesis. A would be what B is plus feature X. So, once more, there could not be any feature that distinguished two hypothetical absolutely simple divine persons, without making it the case that one of them or both were not, after all, absolutely simple. Hence, there can only, in principle, be one divine person. If you want, you can see that there's a very tight structural similarity between what Gell says up here and what I say down here. It's basically the same argument with just a few words changed. The same principles and inferential steps are operative in each argument. I don't think one can accept the original argument then without also accepting this parity. There is, though, yet another problem with Gell's argument here. In particular, it doesn't follow that A would be complex merely from the fact that it has a feature that B lacks. Perhaps A has and is identical to feature X, whereas B has and is identical to feature Y, where X is distinct from Y. In this case, it is simply false that A would be what B is plus feature X. In the case at hand, A is not a composite of everything B has plus feature X. A is simply feature X, and B is simply feature Y, and moreover, X is not Y. None of this requires A to have everything B has with X super added somehow. A is X, pure and simple. B is Y, pure and simple. And X is not Y. X and Y are primitively distinct pure essays, or pure beings. Thus, not only does Gell's second argument inherit the problems of the first, but it also faces a unique problem of its own. According to Gell, what follows from his argument is that pure act theism provides us with an explanation of why there has to be that number of first causes instead of any other, namely because there could in principle be no more than one purely actual thing. So it is a necessary feature of a purely actual thing that it be unique. As I've argued in this section, however, Gell's arguments establish no such thing. For all Gell has said, classical theism does not explain why there is exactly one first cause. All right, on to the second argumentative path from foundational layer. So let's now consider Gell's second argumentative path from a necessarily existent foundational layer of reality. Gell begins by supposing that there is a necessary foundational or fundamental layer of reality that explains, perhaps by sustaining causation, perhaps by grounding, perhaps by constitution or whatever, non-foundational, non-fundamental things. Okay, and this footnote actually got me so excited because I basically say, like, arguments for the existence of such a foundational layer abound. Non-classical theist-friendly arguments are found in Proust and Rasmussen's book Necessary Existence, as well as Rasmussen's book How Reason Can Lead to God. And explicitly classical theistic arguments are found in Feser's Five Proofs of the Existence of God, in particular his Aristotelian, Neoplatonic, Thomistic, and Rationalist proofs, as well as Gavin Kerr's Dante argument. For criticisms of Feser's Aristotelian proof, I give some citations. For criticisms of the Neoplatonic proof, you can see my video, which I've done on that. I've also done videos on the Aristotelian proof. And this is what I'm excited about. And for extensive criticisms of all five of Feser's proofs, as well as the Dante argument as developed in Kerr and others, see Schmid and Linford forthcoming. Oh, I'm so excited. I'm sorry. I'm so excited about this one. Wait, where is it? Here it is. Schmid and Linford forthcoming. Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs with Springer. I'm so excited. Anyway, it is not out yet, but the final manuscript that I'm submitting to Springer for them to start the production process, that is due over the summer. So the production process will be starting up soon. But anyway, back to the section. So Gell is assuming in his second argumentative path that we have a necessarily existent foundational layer of reality. And so he then asks the same two questions as before, right? First, how many foundational entities are there in this foundational layer? And second, why are there exactly that many? And then the dialectic here, of course, then plays out much as before. Classical theism clearly answers the first question, namely one, and Gell relies on his arguments for uniqueness to establish that classical theism offers a satisfying explanation in response to the second question. Now, I've already criticized Gell's arguments for uniqueness, and as I argued, Gell has not shown classical theism's explanatory superiority on this front. Now, I do just want to say here at this juncture that let's just suppose that classical theism answers more questions about the first cause with fewer principles. Now, it clearly doesn't follow from this that classical theism is simpler than naturalism tout court. I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm sorry. Tout court, croissant, tout court. I'm sorry. I'm not French. I do not know how to pronounce this sort of thing. Anyway, it clearly doesn't follow that classical theism is simpler than naturalism simpliciter, right? We don't judge theories, again, by how simple they are only with respect to some small domain. We judge them by their overall simplicity. And once we recognize this, I think it's plausible that Oppi's naturalism is just simpler than classical theism. I think that's quite clear. And once again, the classical theist, no less than a naturalist, is committed to the natural world, including whatever fundamental physical things there are, whether they be superstrings or quarks or mereological simples or quantum fields or the universal wave function or matter energy or whatever. For Oppi's naturalism, again, that's all. But for the classical theist, that's not all. There is, in addition, a transcendent, purely actual, absolutely simple God. This brings with it new vocabulary, new principles, and new ontological commitments that the naturalist does without. I think that's a fundamental point to see. Naturalism is simpler than classical theism. Finally, I want to address Gell's consideration of a naturalist who accepts a purely actual foundation. According to Gell, quote, both immutability and immateriality seem unavoidable and straightforward once the pure actuality of the first cause is embraced, since change is essentially the passage from potency to act, and every material thing is both mutable and potential in many ways. Unfortunately, Gell simply asserts that everything material is changeable and potential in many ways. I mean, perhaps he takes it to be self-evident, but to me, it's by no means self-evident. I mean, I might even, okay, I'm not going to go this far. I mean, I was going to say I might even consider it to be self-evidently false, but I'm not going to go that far. All I'm going to say is that it's clearly not self-evident to me, at least, right? Consider atemporal wave function monism. According to this view, there exists a sui generis, fundamental, physical, non-spatiotemporal entity, the universal wave function. This is a perfectly respectable view that has seen a blossoming of interest in philosophy of physics. This thing is fundamental. It's more fundamental than space-time itself. It actually either grounds or functionally realizes space-time itself. And there are actually some results in physics that support the contention that space-time is actually functionally realized, or in some sense, non-fundamental. It's dependent on some more fundamental non-spatiotemporal reality. And lots of philosophers of physics have developed metaphysical views on the basis of this. One such view is, of course, what I've been terming atemporal wave function monism, and I go into that in more depth in my book with Daniel J. Linford. And again, this is a perfectly respectable view, which has seen a blossoming of interest in philosophy of physics. If we click on this, right, you could see David Albert, Alyssa Ney, Jill North, Julian Barber, and Sean Carroll, and I don't know this guy's first name, Singh. That's his last name. Sorry, Singh. Now, we should at least note that wave function monists differ in how they understand the universal wave function and the relationship between the universal wave function and all of their physical objects. Now, David Albert, Barry Lower, Alyssa Ney, and Jill North, for instance, view the universal wave function as a field defined either on configuration space or on some more exotic state space. We don't need to get into the details here, however. What I say in the main text suffices for the point at hand, so don't worry about all the highfalutin physics that's involved here. Let's go back to the main text. Again, my point here is just, well, firstly, Gell simply asserts that everything material is changeable and potential, but that's actually not at all clear. There's this view where there's a fundamental physical non-spatiotemporal entity, the universal wave function. It's a perfectly respectable view, which has seen a blossoming of interest in philosophy of physics. And if we understand material and physical to be synonymous, well, then it simply follows that there are perfectly respectable views on which there is a fundamental or foundational, unchangeable, timeless material thing. We can also suppose that A, the fundamental layer of reality is necessary, as Gell himself is supposing in this dialectical context, and B, the fundamental layer of reality is cross-world invariant. From all of this, it simply follows that the fundamental atemporal wave function has no potencies for change, for cross-world variance, or for non-existence, or even for existence. It doesn't have any potentials for existence that could be actualized from without. It's a fundamental thing, and it's necessarily existent. So it doesn't have some potential for existence that needs to be actualized by another. And so we therefore seem to have a perfectly respectable naturalist view on which the foundation of reality is a material, unchangeable, purely actual thing. Now, I of course don't claim that this view is true. My point is simply that nothing Gell says rules it out. And yet he would need to rule it out in order to infer the immateriality of the purely actual foundation. So let's finally look at some non-classical theistic routes to uniqueness. So Gell concludes his article by considering two paths to uniqueness that don't require expressly classical theistic assumptions. They just require theistic assumptions. So these are alleged aspects of theism that allow you to give a principled explanation for why there is exactly one first cause. Now, Gell doesn't explicitly defend the first path, but I think it's worth addressing nonetheless. And the first path comes from Hoffman and Rosenkratz, who ask us to consider two coexistent omnipotent beings named Dick and Jane. What lovely names. If this were possible, that is, if there could be two coexistent omnipotent beings named Dick and Jane, then it could happen that at some time t, Dick, while retaining his omnipotence, attempts to move a feather, and at t, Jane, while retaining her omnipotence, attempts to keep that feather motionless. Intuitively, in this case, neither Dick nor Jane would affect the feather as to its motion or rest. Thus, in this case, at t, Dick would be powerless to move the feather, so we got a powerless Dick. And at t, Jane would be powerless to keep the feather motionless. But it is absurd to suppose that an omnipotent agent could lack the power to move a feather or the power to keep it motionless. Therefore, neither Dick nor Jane is omnipotent. As a consequence, it is impossible that there be two coexistent omnipotent agents. So if neither Dick nor Jane is omnipotent, we have an impotent Dick. We also have an impotent Jane, but that's not as interesting, is it? Sorry, you can see that my maturity levels are like through the roof. Okay, we're the argument here is something like premise one. I mean, I'm not wrong, am I? I'm not wrong. If Dick is not omnipotent, then Dick is impotent. So there's literally an impotent Dick. Okay, again, I'm not wrong. So yeah, deal with it. The argument here is something like, one, if two or more omnipotent beings could coexist, then the following conjunction is possible. One such omnipotent being attempts to bring it about that a contingent state of affairs S obtains at time t, and two, another such omnipotent being attempts to bring about another contingent state of affairs S star at t, where S stars obtaining at t is incompatible with S's obtaining at t. Premise 2, necessarily, if conjunct 1 and conjunct 2 of that premise are true, then one omnipotent being is powerless to bring about S at t, while the other is powerless to bring about S star at t. 3, but it cannot be the case that an omnipotent being is powerless to bring S about at t or powerless to bring S star about at t. 4, so two or more omnipotent beings cannot coexist. That is, there could, in principle, only be, at most, one omnipotent being, at least with respect to coexistent omnipotent beings. There could at most be one coexistent omnipotent being, in which case it wouldn't really be coexistent, it would just be existent. The argument is valid, and both 2 and 3 seem plausible enough. But why, though, should we accept premise 1? I mean, as far as I can see, it's simply a non sequitur, right? Like, why would the possible joint satisfaction of conjuncts 1 and 2 follow from the mere possibility of 2 or more omnipotent beings? By my lights, that first premise seems just as implausible as the following parity premise, 1 star. If one omnipotent being could exist, then the following conjunction is possible. 1, this omnipotent being attempts to bring it about that contingent state of affairs S obtains at time t. And 2, this omnipotent being attempts to bring it about that contingent state of affairs S star obtains at t, where S stars obtaining at t is incompatible with S's obtaining at t. Merely from the fact that there could be an omnipotent being, it doesn't follow that this omnipotent being could attempt to bring about 2 incompatible contingent states of affairs. Similarly, merely from the fact that there could be 2 or more omnipotent beings, it doesn't follow that they could both attempt to bring about jointly incompatible contingent states of affairs. Perhaps Dick and Jane's wills are perfectly and essentially in harmony. So, they can't attempt to bring out like jointly incompatible states of affairs. Perhaps both Dick and Jane are essentially perfectly rational and essentially omniscient, and so necessarily coordinate their actions in a consistent manner. Or perhaps their attempting to actualize incompatible states of affairs is impossible, not because 2 coexisting omnipotent beings is impossible, but instead for the following reason. While each individually has the power to actualize the contingent state of affairs in question, neither has the power to actualize it while the other attempts to actualize an incompatible state of affairs. For the actualization of that power would entail a contradiction, and any proper analysis of omnipotence debars the power to actualize contradictions, right? It's similar to how an omnipotent being does have the power to causally determine a creature to do something, but does not have the power to causally determine a creature to do something while the creature is libertarianly free. So lots of entirely consistent hypotheses abound that would render premise 1's antecedent true and consequent false. And so I think premise 1 is just utterly implausible of this argument here. So anyway, that's Gell's first argumentative path. Again, I'm not saying that Gell explicitly defends it. He also doesn't claim that he rejects it in the article. He doesn't claim that he defends it in the article. He just presents it. That's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to evaluate it nonetheless because it's philosophically interesting in its own right, and I don't think that the argument succeeds. So that's Gell's first path. But his second path, with respect to these sorts of non-classical theistic routes to uniqueness, explaining why there's exactly one first cause under a theistic view. So his second path derives from God's unlimited or perfect nature. Gell writes, "It seems plausible that there can only be one absolutely or maximally perfect being, because for there to be 2 of them, they would need to be distinguished, either by a perfection that one of them had and the other lacked, or by having the same perfections to differing degrees. But in each case, either one of them or both would not be an absolutely or maximally perfect being, contrary to hypothesis." Now, this argument, too, doesn't seem to work. It seems to rest first on IOI, and we've already seen why this is problematic. Again, why can't there be 2 perfect beings, each with all the perfections to the maximal degree, that are simply primitively distinct? And it also seems to ignore ways that perfect beings might be differentiated. If, as Christians would have it, being Trinitarian is strictly speaking logically compatible with being perfect, well then surely being Unitarian is likewise logically compatible therewith as well. It's not as though Jews and Muslims, for instance, are prevented from affirming that God is perfect by dint of accepting Unitarianism. In that case, though, there could, at least in principle, be a feature differentiating perfect beings from one another, namely the number of persons in which they exist. Finally, I think Gell's argument once again here is incompatible with Trinitarianism, right? Consider the following parity. And again, I just kind of copied and pasted Gell's argument here and just like took out a few words and just replaced them. So whatever is divine, and this, I actually added these first 2 sentences or whatever. So whatever is divine is absolutely or maximally perfect, and divine persons are divine, of course. Hence, divine persons are absolutely or maximally perfect. But, plausibly, there can only be one absolutely or maximally perfect divine person, because for there to be two of them, they would need to be distinguished, either by a perfection that one of them had and the other lacked, or by having the same perfections to differing degrees. Right? This is basically the exact same thing that Gell himself was saying earlier. But in each case, either one of them or both would not be an absolutely or maximally perfect divine person, contrary to hypothesis. As before, the same principles and inferential steps are operative in each argument, and so I don't think one can accept the original argument without also accepting the parity. So, in conclusion, Gell has argued that classical theism enjoys... Okay. Gell has argued that classical theism enjoys a significant advantage over Oppi's naturalism in terms of its simple and explanatorily illuminating answers to the questions of how many first causes there are and why there is exactly that number of first causes. The goal of my article and video here has been to critically engage with this claim. I began by characterizing classical theism and Oppi's naturalism. I then examined Gell's first argumentative path from causal finitism in favor of the above-mentioned claim. After covering some methodological preliminaries about simplicity, I argued against Gell that Oppi's naturalism is importantly simpler than classical theism. I then argued against Gell's two arguments to the effect that classical theism explains exactly how many first causes there are. Along the way, I connected my findings to wider debates about the gap problem and the Christian doctrine of Trinitarianism. I next examined Gell's second argumentative path from foundational necessity in favor of the above-mentioned claim. I argued that Gell's second path, like the first, doesn't succeed. After that, I considered two non-classical approaches to establishing God's uniqueness, one from omnipotence and another from perfection, and I argued that both approaches fail. Now, of course, while I have been critical of Gell's arguments, I think they're both innovative and thought-provoking. They advance debates about the gap problem, about the relative merits of classical and non-classical theisms, and about Oppi's naturalism. And I hope that my article and my video similarly advance such debates into new territory. And most of all, I hope that they've served you in your pursuit of truth. Again, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications, and consider supporting me on Patreon. There are some very, very special goodies on Patreon, including goodies pertaining to some of the things that I've mentioned in this video. That's the only hint I'm going to give. It's kind of nebulous, but it's a hint. And lots of other things as well, like patron-exclusive videos, patron-exclusive Q&As. There's actually a video between me and Scott Clifton talking about the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument that's just for patrons. There are lots of things just for patrons. I try to spoil you guys as much as I can. So anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron. You can do it, I think, for like any amount, really, per month. Maybe $1 a month, maybe $2 a month. That would be enough to give me like a coffee or something. Maybe even more, right? The higher you go, the better benefits you get. It's genuinely helping me serve you guys and also pay my student debt, which in turn is helping me get an education so that I can use it to put out articles like this and put out videos like this. Anyway, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.